Still the same group. Does the gentleman from New Jersey seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and pass H.Res. 558, urging the European Union to designate Hezbollah in its entirety as a terrorist organization as amended.
The clerk will report the title of the resolution.
House Resolution 558. Resolution urging the European Union to designate Hezbollah in its entirety as a terrorist organization.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Malinowski, and the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Smith, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Malinowski.
I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on H.Res. 558 as amended.
Without objection.
I yield myself such time as I may consume.
So recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in support of H.R. 558, urging the European Union to designate Hezbollah in its entirety as a terrorist organization. I'd first like to thank my dear friend Ted Deutsch, the chairman of our subcommittee on the Middle East, North Africa, and global counterterrorism, for reintroducing this important legislation which previously did pass the House in the 115th Congress. When Ted departs our Foreign Affairs Committee in October, we are all going to miss his voice, particularly on issues regarding the Middle East, and his tireless advocacy and defense of American interest and those of our allies around the world. Now, despite all we know about Hezbollah, a murderous terrorist organization that also serves as an Iranian proxy in the region, our friends and partners in the European Union only include Hezbollah's military branch, not its political branch, on its list of sanctioned terrorist organizations. The government of the United States, in contrast, makes no distinction between its 2 branches and includes Hezbollah in its entirety on the U.S. foreign terrorist organization list because we know they are one and the same. The European Union is long overdue in coming to the same realization. Congress is pleased that many individual European countries have acted despite the position of the EU as a whole. The Arab League and the Gulf Cooperation Council have also designated Hezbollah in its entirety. So it remains troubling that the EU, an organization that shares so many of our values and interests and policy goals, continues to allow Hezbollah's political wing to operate freely, advancing Hezbollah's violent agenda around the world. I urge all my colleagues to support this important resolution and reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from New Jersey reserves. The gentleman from New Jersey is now recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of the resolution and yield myself, pardon me, such time as I may consume.
So recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to start off by thanking my good friend and colleague, Ted Deutsch, for not only introducing this important resolution, but his tremendous work during his tenure in the House, particularly in combating anti-Semitism. There's no better friend of Israel than Ted Deutsch, and there's no better friend of the Jewish community that is under siege here in the United States and around the world than Ted Deutsch. He and I co-chaired the House Anti-Semitism Task Force, and as we all know, or many of my colleagues know, he's leaving on October 1st to head up the American Jewish Committee, AJC. What is AJC's gain is our loss, for Ted has brought character and leadership to this Congress, and he will be deeply missed. And I thank you again for his very, very strong voice. Mr. Speaker, as the Lebanese lira continues its downward decline, Hezbollah has become increasingly reliant on illicit criminal networks across Europe to help finance their criminal enterprise. Combating Hezbollah's malign activity requires robust transatlantic law enforcement cooperation. This can only take place once Hezbollah is designated as a terrorist organization in its entirety. Recognizing an arbitrary distinction between Hezbollah's political and military wings gives Hezbollah space to operate across Europe, providing legal cover for its military wing to continue financing terrorism through its political branch. There is no distinction between Hezbollah's political and military wings. Both serve the same ugly, malign agenda, that seeks to undermine the stability of the Lebanese state, prop up the murderous dictatorship of Bashar al-Assad, and threaten Israel's security. I welcome the recent steps taken by Germany and others to designate Hezbollah in full as a terrorist organization, and all of the European Union needs to do likewise. I reserve the balance of our time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the representative from North Carolina, Ms. Manning.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank my friend, Representative Malinowski, for yielding. I also want to thank my dear friend and colleague, Congressman Ted Deutsch, for his tremendous leadership on this and so many issues as the chairman of the Subcommittee on Middle East, North Africa, and Global Counterterrorism. It is a privilege to serve with him. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of HRES 558, a bipartisan resolution I was proud to help introduce with Chairman Deutsch, urging the European Union to designate Hezbollah in its entirety as a terrorist organization. The Iranian-backed terrorist group Hezbollah is responsible for thousands of civilian deaths, not just in the Middle East, but around the globe. Until 9/11, Hezbollah had killed more Americans than any other terrorist group. And today, it maintains an arsenal of 150,000 rockets aimed at Israel. Just this past week, Hezbollah's leader, Hassan Nasrallah, issued a series of grave threats and provocations against Israel, claiming its missiles are locked on an Israeli offshore gas field, which Israel seeks to develop to export much-needed energy supplies to Europe. This is another reminder of why it is incomprehensible that any EU member can credibly assert any distinction between Hezbollah's so-called military and political wings. The truth is, there is one unified Hezbollah. It is dedicated to carrying out terrorist activities around the world. That is why this bipartisan resolution calls on our partners in the EU to take a stronger stand against worldwide terrorism by designating Hezbollah as a whole as a terrorist organization. We must continue to keep pressure on Hezbollah and all other terrorist groups that threaten the United States and our ally Israel and undermine peace, security, and stability throughout the region. I urge support for this bipartisan measure. I thank Chairman Deutsch for his steadfast leadership on this important issue, and I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields. The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
I reserve.
The gentleman reserves. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized. Mr. Smith.
We have no further requests. I yield back to balance of our time.
The gentleman yields. The gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Malinowski, is recognized.
I yield 6 minutes to the representative from Florida, Mr. Deutsch.
The gentleman, my friend from Florida, is now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank my good friend, Mr. Malinowski, for yielding and for his friendship and leadership. And kind words. I thank my other friend from New Jersey, so many friends from New Jersey, for your leadership, Mr. Smith, and for your kind words. I thank Ms. Manning for hers as well, both her leadership and kind words. I rise today in support of House Resolution 558, which urges the European Union to designate Hezbollah in its entirety as a terrorist organization. Mr. Speaker, this is Hezbollah. Hezbollah that bombed the U.S. Embassy in Beirut, the U.S. and French Marine barracks in Beirut, the Israeli Embassy in Buenos Aires, the EMEA Jewish Center in Buenos Aires, bombed Khobar Towers in Saudi Arabia, and has, as Ms. Manning pointed out, over 150,000 rockets pointed at Israeli civilians. First, I'd like to thank Chairman Meeks and Ranking Member McCall for their leadership on the Foreign Affairs Committee and for bringing this resolution to the floor today. I also want to extend my gratitude to my good friend from Florida, Mr. Bill Rakis, for partnering with me on this resolution, and to Ranking Member Joe Wilson for his leadership on the subcommittee, for his commitment to working with me on this and a host of so many other critical issues critical to America's security. I would also like to take this moment on the House floor to thank my Foreign Affairs staff, Sophie Mervis, MENA staff director, professional staff member Jack Steinberg, and of course, Casey Custon, our former staff director. Mr. Speaker, 10 years ago, a Hezbollah suicide bomber blew up a bus in Burgas, Bulgaria. On that bus were 42 Israeli tourists, mostly young people. That day, Hezbollah ended 5 lives, injured 32 others. In 2013, almost exactly 1 year later, the European Union took action to designate Hezbollah's military wing as a terrorist organization. But the inadvertent result of this designation was that a false distinction was made, a false distinction between Hezbollah's military and political wings. Let me be clear. There are no different branches of Hezbollah. It is, in its entirety, a terrorist organization. You don't need to take my word for this. The United States government makes no distinction between the organization's branches and includes Hezbollah in its entirety on the U.S. foreign terrorist organization list. But you also don't need to take our government's word for it, or the word of Germany or Israel or Guatemala, Argentina, the United Kingdom, or the many other countries that have designated all of Hezbollah, rightfully, as a terrorist organization. Take Hezbollah's word for it. One of their own representatives in the Lebanese parliament explicitly said, and I quote, "The military wing of Hezbollah is inseparable from its political wing," close quote. It is a fact that Hezbollah is one unified terrorist organization, an organization that, with support from the Iranian regime, has carried out horrific terror attacks around the globe and continues to spread violence and terror throughout the Middle East. It is an Iranian terror proxy, the same Iranian regime whose president last night on American television deemed the reality of the Holocaust, deemed it false, denied the reality of the Holocaust, and denied Israel's very right to exist. Iran-backed Hezbollah consistently threatens Israel and its citizens with drones, missiles, threats of invasion, and undermines stability and economic opportunity in Lebanon. What's more, the organization supports the brutal Assad regime and is complicit in its murder of more than 500,000 people from the ongoing conflict in Syria. The facts are clear. Around the world, Hezbollah should be designated as a terrorist organization in its entirety. That's why I stand in support of this resolution. As global partners of the United States and key players in the international rules-based order, the EU must designate all of Hezbollah a terrorist organization so we can increase global cooperation to isolate and dismantle the group. Now, I recognize there are legal concerns from our European friends that designating all of Hezbollah as a terrorist organization could prevent support for the Lebanese people, as Hezbollah has infiltrated the country's political system. But the EU rightfully recognizes Hamas in its entirety as a terrorist organization, despite the fact that Hamas operates as a political party in Gaza. This does not impact the EU's ability to support Gaza reconstruction, just as designating Hezbollah as a whole would not prevent the EU from supporting the needs of the people of Lebanon and the refugees inside Lebanon. It's time for the EU to fix this false distinction once and for all, and the global momentum is on our side. In 2016, the Gulf Cooperation Council and the Arab League both designated Hezbollah as a terrorist organization with no distinction between its political and military wings, despite Lebanon being a member of the Arab League. The EU should take note of that. A full EU designation now would demonstrate Europe's commitment to cracking down on Iran's use of proxy terrorist groups, destabilizing the region, and attacking our shared national security priorities. This resolution sends an important message to our European allies. More can and must be done to counter the Iranian proxy Hezbollah, which begins with calling them what they are, a terrorist organization in its entirety that's committed to the destruction of our ally Israel, continues to undermine the values and interests of both the United States and Europe. It's time for the EU to join us in designating Hezbollah in its entirety. A nearly identical measure passed this House in 2017 by a voice vote. And as I conclude, if I may have an additional 90 seconds.
90 seconds to the
Gentleman is recognized for an additional 90 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I came to Congress in April 2010 committed to standing up to Iran's malign activities and support for Hezbollah as a prime example. And as I prepare to conclude my time in this chamber, I urge my colleagues to continue to unite the world against Iran's terror proxies, to boldly take action to ensure Iran never has nuclear weapons, never forgets that the U.S. will always stand against its human rights violations, against its support for terror, against its anti-Semitism, against its calls for Israel's destruction, against its unlawful detention of Americans, Murad Tabaz, Ahmad Shargi, Siamak Namazi, Bakr Namazi, and refuses to bring closure to the family of Bob Levinson. My colleagues, we must continue to stand up to Iran's aggression. Today's vote is a vote to urge our European allies to designate all of Hezbollah what it is, an Iran-backed terror proxy. I thank my colleagues for their cooperation on this bill. I thank them for their friendship all these many years, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields. The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
I'm ready to close, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I strongly agree with Representative Deutsch. I've always believed the first principle of foreign policy is to call things by their proper name. Sometimes we have to be pragmatic in our dealings around the world, but always start by being honest. Hezbollah is a terrorist organization. Say it. The European Union should do so as well. Today, we are being heard again on a bipartisan basis, loud and clear, and I hope the European Union hears our message. Hope my colleagues will join us in supporting this resolution, and I yield the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and agree to House Resolution 558 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of Chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative, for what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia rise?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I request the yeas and nays.